you define hate speech and what distinguishes it from other forms of expression?
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
so much.
I can start now, right?
Yes.
Okay. Um, I'm not sure if anyone wants to give any feedback to the video that you watched. You can put it in the chat group. What do you think about it? While I'm addressing these questions that were posted to me. Thank you for everyone for joining. I think before we get into what is hate speech, I think it's very important to understand what is freedom of expression. And because to understand hate speech, we need to know what is freedom of expression and what is hate speech, because there's definitely differences between freedom of expression and freedom of hate speech. Um, I just want to quote some of the international law articles on what is freedom of expression. Basically, under if you want to talk about or you want to refer to what is freedom of expression, the important documents that we always refer is Article 19 of International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So there's like three articles under the ICCPR, which is Article 19.1, which gave absolute protection to the right to freedom of expression and opinion, and there's no limitation. That means you, me, and everyone in this world, we have right to express ourselves and opinion. That is provided under the Article 19 of ICCPR, right? Article 19.2 of ICCPR is basically everyone have the right to freedom of expression, and this right should be given and should be provided by the government, the state. And we all have right to seek information and also right to speech, opinion, and we can seek for any kind of opinion or receive or impart regardless of frontiers, regardless medium that we want to, whether it's printed, whether it's audio, whether it's movies, in any way of our choice, right? So Article 19.1 is basically, it's giving us absolute protection to right to freedom of expression. Article 19.2 is the government has obligation to provide you and me the right to freely express ourselves. And they should provide an environment where we can seek this information or we can freely express our opinion without any interference, right? The Article 19.3 is the article that has given obligations for the state to limit or restrict a speech. So Article 19.3 is also important to understand that any restrictions to freedom of expression must follow three-part test under the ICCPR. So that means the three-part test means like it has to be provided by law. It has to have legitimate aim. When we talk about legitimate aim under the international law, that means like a speech or opinion can be restricted if it falls into category that it's harm the public safety or national security or public order or public health. Um, so this is a legitimate aim. So if a government want to restrict a speech, for example, it has to fall into this category of legitimate aim. If it doesn't fall into these categories of legitimate aim, then it's not, it is freedom of expression and it shouldn't be restricted. And any form of sanctions against or any form of restriction must be necessary and proportionate. When we say necessary and proportionate, meaning it has to be the sanction has to be proportionate. So if for example, if the jail term is like maximum is 5 years, but whatever that your speech is actually doesn't even fall into the 5 years jail term, it has to be very proportionate. So whatever sanction has to be very necessary and also proportionate. So these are the three things that you need to understand when we want to limit a speech. It has to have these three-part test, and every government, every state has to follow this before they restrict any speech, because restrictions or limiting any freedom of expression, if it doesn't fall into this category, then it's a violation of human rights, a violation of somebody's rights, right? So you have to make sure that we understand this international law part to understand what is hate speech. Now, moving into hate speech, unfortunately, we don't have a unified definition of hate speech under the international law. Just because hate speech, the context is different from country to country, and it can be differ from one to another. In even whatever that we see in Semenanjung, Malaysia, it could be different in Sabah and Sarawak. If, to make it more closer to you, it's very different even from district to district sometimes. But what the human rights communities agreed principally and also around the world, although we don't have unified definition, but we do believe that the hate speech undermines the right to equality. Okay, so that is what we agreed. So we don't have unified definition, but that's what we agreed. Hate speech undermines right to equality or right to exist of somebody in an equal manner. And hate speech is not always manifested in a clear language of hater, but it could be received differently by different audience, especially audience that being protected under the international law. Sometimes stereotypes, false accusations, or rumors about some community or certain part of the society might not be a direct hate speech, but in the long run, it could be hate speech, and it could even incite violence or discrimination. So hate speech is not something that very easy for you to say this is hate speech, and this is freedom of expression. Sometimes it really takes a lot of ways to understand, but also to identify whether it's hate speech or it's not hate speech. Yeah. And one of the articles that basically in ICCPR that covers hate speech is Article 22 of ICCPR, where the article says any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitute incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence shall be prohibited by law. So most of the time, hate speech, the speeches that fall into this category, that inciting violence or discrimination or hostility, we call it hate speech, but it fall into these articles. That means it has to be prohibited. But whenever we want to restrict a speech, even hate speech, we have to follow through the three-part test that I was talking about just now. So Article 22 and Article 19.3 of ICCPR is like, it's complement each other. Even it's a hate speech, you need to follow through the three-part test. And that's what in international law is saying. Yeah.
Thank you, Nali, for the answers. So now I want to explore more, and I want to ask a question about what potential impact does hate speech have on society?
Well, there's a lot impact the hate speech have on society. First and foremost, hate speech incite violence and intolerance. Yeah, and that the devastating effect of hatred is sadly nothing new. But because of the new communication technologies like social media and everything, it has become even more and more amplified. And the worst case scenario of hate speech is like it can lead to atrocities, like genocide, for example. That is the worst case of genocide. And it's not only hate speech is not only affect the dignity and human rights of the individual that being directly targeted by hate speech, but also of persons belonging to the same minority group or group as those directly targeted. So it actually has a lot of impact. And one of the most dangerous impact of hate speech, it creates divisions in the society as a whole. It affects the participation and inclusion of all those targeted. And this targeted people that being targeted by hate speech, they will be increasingly excluded from society. Yeah. When somebody is excluded from society, that means you can't participate in democracy process. You can't get justice. You can't get your basic rights like education, housing, even freedom of speech and stuff like that. So I think I think one of the worst thing that I heard from the victims of hate speech is like how exclusion from society is actually even more painful when they say that we actually exist, but we don't exist, you know. And I think that is more painful where people really exist, but then because of they are being, you know, excluded for their identity or where they came from, they're actually being excluded from everything in the society. And I think that is really painful, you know. And history shows that hate speech has also been intentionally used to mobilize groups and society against each other in order to provoke violent escalation, hate crime, war, or even genocide. So hate speech actually have a lot of impact to the whole world, but also to society that we live in. It increases stereotypes, it increases prejudice, it increases intolerance, it, you know, it widens the polarization. And and I think, as I said, that it also take away your right to coexist in the same world as everybody else. And I think that is one of the biggest impacts of hate speech. And it's not something that you know, only people who end receiving the hate speech would understand how painful it is, you know, and how they're impacted by hate speech. I think even for us who, you know, who might not be the end receiver of hate speech, even we are affected by this whole thing, right? Like hate and things that are happening around. And imagine those who are affected directly from that. Yeah.
Thank you, Nalini, for the answer. So the answer made me understand how the dangers of the hate speech. So we have to identify the hate speech to understand how to avoid. So I have a question to concerning how to identify the hate speech. Are there any specific tool or resources available to aid in identification monitoring of hate speech, particularly online?
I think one of the things that Article 19 and also that we are using for our monitoring work on hate speech is like we have this tool called six-part test of Rabat Plan of Action. So Rabat Plan of Action is UN framework. So you know it was created by lots of people around the world who come together to have this document that to give some sort of guideline to the government, to the civil societies, to the media, to everyone that involved in society. So it's like a whole society approach kind of UN document that gives guidance to all of us how we can prevent, how we can counter hate speech. So one of the things that has been identified in Rabat Plan of Action, so you can Google and maybe I can share later, is the six-part test. So it's basically a test where you have 6 elements to identify whether the speech or whatever you read or you claim hate speech, whether it's hate speech or not. So the six-part test is basically what you need to know is like you need to know the social and political context. So in the test, number one is the social and political context. So you need to know, you need to see what is the social context of what has been expressed. What is the social context and political context in the country that we're talking about? The second is the speaker. So when we talk about hate speech, you need to understand there is a triangle relationship. Yeah. Um, when we talk about the triangle relationship, it has to have hate speaker, it has to have targeted group, and then you need to have a public audience. So when we talk about this triangle relationship, the speaker is very important. Who is the speaker is very important. So if the speaker is somebody who has um, 10 followers on Twitter, for example, you need to see the weight of the speaker. But if the speaker is a politician or someone influential who can influence, you know, the society or politically or socially, then you need to see who is the speaker, whether the speaker has a lot of influence or not. So the speaker is the second important in the Rabat Plan of test, the six-part test. So the who is the speaker? What is the background of the speaker? So you have to see that. And number three is like intent of the speaker. What is the intention of the speaker? What is the intention of the expression? Whether the expression is to call for violence or whether the intention to call for, to exclude some community, or to, to cause harm against certain community, for example, or groups of people. So you need to see the intention of the expression as well. Number four, the content and form of the expression. What is the content of the expression? You know, or the form of expression, how it has been expressed, what are the elements that being used? Is it threat, it is harassment, or is it calling for violence? You have to see the content of the expression. Number five, you need to see the extension of the expression. So as I said, whether you have to see whether that particular speech or opinion or expression, where it was shared, whether it was shared on Twitter with like how many followers, or 100,000 followers, or it was aired on, on TV or radio, or a live program, or in Charama, for example. So you need to see the extension of the expression. If 10 followers, probably only 5 people of you, then, you know, but if 100,000 followers and the view is like probably like 1 million, then the danger is different. The extension of expression is amplified even more. So you need to see that. And number six, the final one, then you need to look the likelihood of that expression causing harm to the group of people they are targeting, and what happened to them. That is very important. So what is the harm being done because of this expression, right? So these are the 6-part tests that we use in all our monitoring work. I know it will take some time, but as I say, it's not something easy for me to come and say, this is hate speech, or this is not. As a responsible activist, I need to really go through the 6-part test, and then we need to come out and say whether it's hate speech or not. Sometimes, as I say, the triangle relationship is very important. When you have the speaker, when you have the targeted group, and you have the public audience, sometimes you can just decide based on the context of how the expression being expressed and who are expressing. Then sometimes it's easy to make some decision whether it's hate speech or not. But sometimes you really need to go through the 6-part test to see whether it's hate speech or not. So that's the tool that I would actually propose to people to use it. Usually when I do my training, it's like 2 days training. We use this to we give practical tests to people to understand more by doing a lot of case studies. Then you will understand how to identify hate speech. It's not something that I can do today in 1 hour, but it's something that people has to go for these workshops and training to understand more. So it would be easy in future for you to identify what is freedom of expression and what is hate speech. The most important for us is to understand what is freedom of expression. As long as you understand what is the freedom of expression, then you will know the limitation of the speeches that you shouldn't be saying, or you shouldn't be jumping into in hate or whatever. Yeah.
Thank you, Nalini, for the suggestion and answer. And so I have the question also related to identification. So how do you navigate the challenge of identifying hate speech, especially in case where it may be disguised or subtle?
Okay, I think, as I said earlier, I think once we understand the tool and the nuances of freedom of expression and the issues and the context of hate speech, I think it will be much more easier. For me, the challenging part, I think in the context of Malaysia, I don't find it challenging for me. I think because I've been using the tool. This is kind of everyday work for me. Um, but I think what we need to understand most importantly is like hate speech is differ from one place to another. Um, and what we see sensitive in Malaysia doesn't mean it'll be sensitive for the entire world. But it's very important for anyone we want to talk about hate speech to understand the context. Some things in Malaysia is very normalized languages, very normalized attitudes and behavior. Certain times we don't really see that as it's actually contributing to violence or contributing to polarization or even exclusion of certain community, like for example, refugees or LGBT or migrants, right? For example. it's so normalized in our community to make fun of certain things. It's so normalized that that certain things in Malaysia, for example, people seeing that as a joke. For example, racism, right? Like making fun of somebody's skin color. Sometimes it's very normalized, but it's racism and it can cause a lot of tension. So I think it's important to understand that context, and I think that we won't have any challenges when we understand the context of how freedom of expression works, and what is freedom of expression. And people also need to understand that freedom of expression doesn't mean it's just that you just talk about nice things. Freedom of expression is also right to it also have protection to offensive statements or unpopular opinions. Sometimes it can be really, really disgusting. Sometimes it can be, inappropriate for some people. But if you go to the freedom of expression standards, it's still freedom of expression, it's still protected. Yeah, it will be very, it's not nice to hear certain things, but under the international standard, it will be protected. But unless that speech is calling for violence, or causing discriminations or causing harm, then you have to deal with it differently. Yeah, so I think the challenges is to people to really understand what is freedom of expression first, and then then understanding hate speech, because I think every day I'm hearing people say everything is hate speech, which is not true. It might be unpopular, you don't like it, it doesn't mean it's hate speech. So yeah, I think that that's very important for us to understand those things, the basic of it, and then we can, I think eventually we'll find it much more easier to understand this concept in our daily life, I think. Yeah.
Thank you, Nalini. So for understanding the hate speech, the definition of hate speech, and then we know how to identify the hate speech. But mostly importantly is how we're going to avoid hate speech from our daily life. So concerning this question, concerning how to avoid from our daily life, I would like to ask a question. What proactive measure can be taken at the society level to prevent the spread of hate speech?
Well, I think there are a lot of things we need to change. Talking about in Malaysian context, we need to change. There are so many the environment that we have politically, and also socially and culturally. We have policies that not for everyone. We have very discriminatory environment in Malaysia. We have very discriminatory policies towards certain people, and I think that one of the reasons why hate speech, exists, because of the discrimination, because of the stereotypes, the hostile environment, and that caused polarization, widening the polarization. We need to definitely change our education system, to be acceptable of diversity, different opinion in different people, different identities. I think our education system is very important to teach everyone, how to be more empathetic, how to be more acceptable to different people and different ideas and different opinions. Schools and universities and any form of educational institution has to be more open to it, and we need to generate those kind of discussions and dialogue within our children and everyone, so that we can produce a society where we can have a very civilized discussion on very sensitive issues, for example, or very complicated issues. But it can be done in that way. So people need to be taught to discuss, to learn about each other, to learn about each other's, culture and how they are different and stuff like that. I think that is lacking in Malaysia. One of the reasons contributing to hate speech is also how the lack of or restrictive environment. If you see, the more limited environment of freedom of expression, the more hater the society has, more prejudice, right? Because you don't have enough information about these communities, for example, or group of people. and we don't allow that conversation to take place, like the differences and how communities are different, how their practices are different. We don't have this conversation. We don't have information for people to go and understand why there are people different. They look different or they do things differently. I think we need to have an environment where we're able to, have a conversation openly about each other and then understanding each other. And I think that would help us to create a society where, that we can embrace differences. And I think that is one of the contributing factor for polarization and for hate speech. And I think um, we also need a very effective and sustainable measure to prevent hate speech. For example, one of the things that Article 19, also MCCHR and all the other NGOs are proposing over and over again on all our campaigns or even our advocacy work is like to adopt Rabat Plan of Action as part of policies, and so that we can open up, we can invite everyone who's part of the society, like media, politicians, political parties, NGOs, to come together, and encounter hate speech together. So I think that whole society policies, we need that in Malaysia, and I think that would be very, very helpful to counter hate speech and to bring back, more diversity kind of diverse environment in Malaysia. I think that is very, very important for us to understand. And also I just want to say, like, to the questions like how we can prevent hate speech and everything. Um, and I think one of the things that people can do is, like, when you see something is happening online, somebody is saying certain nasty things or spreading hatred, I think for us, just pause yourself, refrain from making any hateful comments, um, try to go and do a fact checking, on the topics that people are discussing. I think that is very, very easy to do and something that we can do in our daily life, right? Just Google and get a fact checking and everything. So you can detect, you can find for information whether what people are saying online is true or not, and then sometimes there are websites available on certain issues, and you can go and check and then educate ourselves on those issues. And I think that would refrain us from, spreading hatred. If you know better, if you have more information, use that information to spread the right, um, or the right information about whatever people are discussing. I think that is very, very important. And I think we all should play a role to spread more positive messages, um, and instead of jumping into those conversations and feeling great about it and that I have contributed something to this discussion. I think that is something that very important. But if you see certain um, expressions or speeches or opinion online that you think is really dangerous or inciting violence, please feel free to report, to the social media companies you're seeing that expression, and then I think that is first step that you can do, that report those posts. That's very important for the social media companies also. Yeah.
Thank you, Nalini, for the answer. Knowing the fact check and education yourself is very important. So I would like to ask a question about, can you share example of successful strategies or intervention that you have been involved in or witnessed that effectively prevent hate speech and promote inclusively?
Um, um, I think this, I don't know if people are aware of this. In 2020, there was a Twitter post by Mahathir Mohamad, the former prime minister. So he posted lot. It's a so many. I mean, it was like so many comments. He posted like 13 or 14 points of what happened in France at that point of time. There was a killing in France, um, and then he posted on Twitter, Muslims have a right to be angry, and to kill millions of French people for the massacre of the past, for example. He posted that. And we came across that. I have a very different opinion on what's happening in France, because in France, the Muslim communities are being, oppressed because they're minority, they're being oppressed, and they're being taken away their right to express themselves, to dress and stuff like that. There are so many other issues, but none of us is condoning the violence that happens against anyone, right, in particular. But Mahathir's post was very dangerous, very, very dangerous, because basically, you say that you can go and kill people. The first thing when we come across that, we actually reported. So luckily, my colleagues in London was having a meeting with Twitter at that time, like at that point of time when the post was posted. So, I just reported to them, and then they reported to Twitter, and then Twitter actually take a really fast step saying to ask him to remove the post, and they actually removed the post after that as well. One thing that my colleague told me the moment I told her what's going on, and she told me, can you just check in the comments if anyone is actually planning to go to the French embassy in Malaysia and trying to do something? That is the danger of that speech, right? Then we were checking all the comments, so nobody is like, taking action saying, let's go to French embassy and kill anyone or something like that. So that is something that I think is positive outcome of, like, when we quickly respond to those kind of um, posts. That is very direct, that is hate speech, very direct, it's calling for violence and stuff like that. So easy for us to report, and he's a former prime minister who has millions of followers, for example. So that is one of the, I wouldn't say, I don't know whether it's successful or not, but I think it's good that we reacted very fast, and we managed to take down the post immediately before something really serious happened after that. And during the COVID time as well. So there were so many things was going on at that point of time, and on top of it, this was happening. So yeah.
Thank you for the answer. So now we're going to moving on the legal system. Um, Before you mention about the ICCPR, so I want to mention something like Article 19 of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I would like to make everyone to understand this is the content of the Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression, and this right includes freedom to hold opinion without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and idea to any media and regardless of frontier. And the other article I'd like to mention is Article 10, subparagraph A of Federal Constitution of Malaysia. And this is every citizen has a right to freedom of speech and expression. And both articles related to the freedom of expression. So concerning the legal framework, I would like to ask Lanini, what roles do laws and regulation play in preventing hate speech, and how can they be strengthened to better protect vulnerable groups?
To be honest, most of the laws around the world, it's very problematic to begin with, because we don't have unified definition of hate speech, right? So it's very different from country to country, and sometimes the only thing that the state or the government is looking into is criminalizing speeches. Article 19, our organization, we believe that one, we need to address the root causes of hate speech, right? The root causes of hate speech is like inequality. So we need to have those policies in place before we even talk about hate speech laws, or criminalizing speeches, for example. We need to address the root causes, the inequality, existing discrimination, unequal policies, failure of social and political institutions, lack of information, because there's a restrictive environment with a lot of repressive laws in Malaysian context. And we have very lack of civic space to discuss those issues because of the repressive environment. So what we usually propose to government, even when in our engagement with government, is like we need to identify, we need to address the root causes first. That means you need to have progressive legislations or progressive policies to deal with those root causes, the inequality. So we need to have anti-discrimination law, or we need to, or equality law, for example, that covers everybody that we have in society. So we need that sort of, policies to address root causes of hate speech. Then we can talk about regulations. When we talk about um, measures, right? How to prevent hate speech. We have three ways. One is measures that two positive measures, which is one very civil kind of measure or administrative measure. That means like when we talk about civil, for example, if migrant workers, they have been going through hate speeches and there was issues going on. I think the first thing we need to do when we talk about civil measure is like we need to give them that space for them to come out and tell their story in media, in everywhere, right to redress. They need to get the justice. They need to be protected, for example. That are civil measures where you're not relying so much on criminalization, but it's more a human angle of it, how you deal with it. The second is administrative measure. We are talking about code of conduct, for example. Let's say, media is sensationalized certain issues and it became very, it caused harm to society because of that. And there should be like now, of course, we're talking about Media Council Act, where the media industry, will look into it, the behaviors of media and journalists. So we need to have those kind of measures, like code of conduct or right to, or apologize publicly or openly or whatever you said or for whatever you caused and things like that. So for Article 19, criminalization of speech is the last resort, right? It should be the last resort. And we have to follow the Article 22 of ICCPR. If it fall into that category of inciting violence, it has to be prohibited, and any form of sanctions of that behavior should be necessary and should be proportionate. And then the criminalization, it's I think is justified in that manner. Even when we talk about Rabat Plan of Action, or even there's another UN resolution 1680, these two UN frameworks is actually promoting more positive measures, not relying on criminalization, right? But more positive measures like changing behavior of people in society. For example, doing trainings for teachers, doing training for lawyers or judges, or human rights commissioners, and NGOs, students, youth, everyone who involved in society being trained to understand, all these things. So these are the measures that the UN is promoting as well. So not so much relying on criminalization, because what happened when we rely on criminalization, the danger is the legitimate speeches are being restricted. The danger is when we talk about hate speech law, most of the time it used against legitimate freedom of expression, right? The laws that we have in Malaysia is used for preventing or restricting legitimate freedom of expression. It's not being used for anyone who actually involved in hate speeches, for example. There's no um, actions being taken against them, for example. That because the laws are so vague and so problematic, it's always used against those who actually have legitimate freedom of action. That is the danger of when we talk about legislation. So that's why that we are promoting more of those measures, the positive measures, so that we can have a society that, relies so much on those measures that bringing people together instead of, you know, relying so much on criminalization. I think criminalization should be the last resort and only when it's necessary. Yeah.
Yes, thank you for the answer. So now we know that the training and the legal systems, so this legal law is sometimes problematic. So, but I have a questions that also related to law, which is how do these legal frameworks balance the protection of freedom of expression with the need to regulate hate speech?
I think as I mentioned earlier, right, I think the first and foremost about the legal framework is like first, it has to recognize the right to freedom of expression. It has to recognize that the limitation of freedom of expression, you have to follow the three-part test. And then to regulate hate speech, you also still need to look into the Article 22 of ICCPR and Article 19.3 of ICCPR. So that's how you look into the legal framework, right? The law, if you are talking about law on hate speech or anything, it has to be clearly defined. It has to be. It cannot be vague, because that then it's open door for misuse of the law, and that opens the door for anyone to be to be the victim of those this law. So I think it has to be very, very careful. We always can refer back to the ICCPR, how the wordings in ICCPR. We always can look at some of the laws that we have around the world, maybe from UK or or from New Zealand, for example. So we can look into these best practices that we have, but eventually the legal framework balance comes with understanding those concepts from international law perspective. And I think that's when you can find the balance, because that's the standards anyway. So the law should have those spirit as well of the international law. That's what I think.
Thank you, Nanini. And I'd like to mention the specific cases as an example of the hate speech. So we have to know how to differentiate hate speech and a normal talk. Like there's cases about the stand-up comedy, Singaporean-born stand-up comedy, Jocelyn Shea. She speak about the joke of the tragedy of disappearance of Malaysia Airline flight NH370, and she used to work and not fly in a public speech, which touched upon other people's tragedy. So I have a question about this case. So how can we distinguish between hate speech and jokes or normal talks like this?
I would like to ask people here what they think about it before I if anyone have any opinion about the stand-up comedy.
Why would
I think I can give some of my opinions.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Actually, I don't. I saw the news, but I didn't read everyone's opinion on this. But for me, when it comes to jokes, of course, we should be open and because it's jokes, right? But sometimes I don't really understand why stand-up comedy nowadays likes to use all these kind of jokes. Not just about MH370. Some even using rape jokes, hate jokes, and I think it's the cross boundaries lah. But I know some our stand-up comedians also support saying that it's just jokes, why are we being very political correct or something. But for me, we should be more aware lah, because some things are okay for us, but how about the family members ke apa kan? Yeah, I know
Anyone?
it's yeah, okay, yeah.
Thanks, Azura. Thank you. Anyone else? Any other opinion? Just want to go back to the Jocelyn Chia. I just want to give a perspective from a freedom of expression point of view, right? Yes, I agree. It's very distasteful. It's very offensive. But I think, and I think we can actually debate about this. People having, people bringing this sensitive thing is part of their stand-up comedy or jokes. But I just want to bring back certain a discussion to it. We can talk about it, in another platform. But I think we need to understand that freedom of expression protects all form of speech, including speech that may be considered of lower value or or it's downright trivial, right? And more generally, the right to freedom of expression protects not only the freedom to express alarming ideas, but also to express ideas in alarming ways. I think that's her joke was. And freedom of expression is also, you have right to offend, shock, disturb, and stuff like that. But I think, I also understand why it's very, very sensitive and why it shouldn't be used as part of the joke. But I just want people to go back in understanding the larger picture of um, freedom of expression, because freedom of expression is a very unique, it's a huge spectrum itself, and um, I think it's very important to understand in that way. But definitely, I think it was very distasteful, it's very offensive, and maybe it's very inconsiderate for especially the families who still healing in that, at this point of time, not knowing what really happened to their family members. But I think we have to right to joke is actually part of freedom of expression, and that's about it. Unless her jokes calling for something else, even more, if she say even more words than that. So I think we have to see case by case, um, and it's important to understand in this whole spectrum as well. I think that's a case study. It's a very good case study to even to discuss and debate about it. I remember we were talking even in within Article 19 about this as well. But actually, just going back to the standards of what we all are, what we actually um, promoting as well. So I think it's very, very important to look into that way. But also what happened to her because of what she said. If you notice, there was the Malaysian government was, or police was calling for Interpol raid notice or something like that for what she said. That is wrong, that is extreme. So the consequences of that is also there are people using that to misuse their power and stuff like that. So I think it's something really good to discuss, maybe in a different day or different platform, but just to understand, it's still within the framework of freedom of expression. Although I disagree with what she said, for example. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for the answer. So now we will moving on to our Q&A session. And I received some questions from our participants from the email. So the first question is, sorry. Our first question is, do you suggest any policy that can help reduce hate crime in society? This is a
Yeah.
question from a participant.
Yeah, I think I stated earlier, like some of the policy that I suggested is also using the UN framework, Rabat Plan of Action, and UN Resolution 1618, which I think covers a lot of issues, under this. So I think that could be something you can look into it. You also can, whoever is free, also can visit Article 19 website. There are a lot of documents, case studies, best practices, from other countries. We have documented, so you can go and have a look at it from our website. So yeah. So question 2 is, what legal and policy measures can we take in
Yeah,
government
the question.
officials or
Yeah.
to engage in hate speech targeting specific groups? I think first of all, they have politicians and government officials, state institutions, they have more responsibility first to refrain from, engaging in hate speech. That is for sure. Because they are people in power. They shouldn't be propagating or influencing people to hate, a specific groups. And I think there should be more measures in terms of, I think there should be a lot of, one of the things that we're trying to do is like having this engagement with government, introducing the same policy that I was talking about, how they can take actions within their own, for example, within government offices. There should be a code of conduct, there should be guidelines, to understand and all sort of things. But the first thing, they should never be the perpetrator of hate speech. I mean, in most cases they are, sadly. So, that should be some of the measures that we take. And of course, we need to have a bit more measures to make sure that politicians and government officials doesn't engage and doesn't, they shouldn't be the perpetrator of hate speech. Yeah.
Okay, moving on to question 3 from our participant. Expression question doubts and belief alone without target those who hold such a doubts, belief, hate speech.
Okay, I think I'll just give okay, the international law is, for example, is very clear. It protects individuals from any form of, violations, for example, right? Um, international law doesn't protect symbols or like it doesn't protect religious books or anything, right? It protects individuals. But if the individuals who believe in certain religion or certain thoughts or beliefs are being under attack, then there's a danger, right? Individuals should be protected. So that means like if people being under attack because of them being Muslims or because them being Hindu or because of their identity as Buddhist or anything, and that is violation, and that actions should be taken. And I think the international standard is basically say people can have opinion about all these books or symbols or anything, but it protect people who are being under attack because of their beliefs. So I think usually people should be protected from whatever that they believe, and I think it should be open. um, I mean, I understand in the current situation in Malaysia, it's not easy for people to even have opinion about certain things because it's becoming very chaotic. I think one thing that, as I said, mentioned earlier, we need to create a society where we should be able to understand, for example, what happened in the KK Mart issues, right? For example, why it's very offensive, why it's so sensitive for the Muslim community to have the words Allah being printed in socks or whatever. The people from other communities need to understand the sensitivity of the Muslim communities as well. And I think there should be a room for us to create that room for us to accept the differences, the sensitivity, and understanding that okay, it is sensitive to certain people, then I should be understandable of that. And I think we need to create that kind of environment for people to be sensitive, and understanding of each other. So I think that is what lacking in Malaysia. And that's why you can see sometimes very chaotic when some things like this happen and people just throwing and their opinion and stuff like that. And it's becoming more and more chaotic. I think we need to create an environment where we can talk about this without need to resort to violence or very chaotic kind of environment, but much more matured kind of discussions where everyone can understand. And I mentioned it start from education, and it should be starting from schools and institutions. Yeah.
Thank you, Nalini. Thank you, Nalini. And we received a question from our chat box, and there's a question. Can you share with us your experience with government agency on working on the issue? Are they open to legal and policy reform?
Okay. Hello. Um, I think I think for the last 8 years, I think there are very slow kind of engagement, I think, and also because the government changes quite often in the last 8 years as well, right? So I think from my experience, talking to government, whether it's ministries or agency, I think For sure, what I'm seeing is that they want to have some sort of measure or some sort of, well, they always talk about, law in that sense, but I think they also seeing there's a danger. There's also problem when we talk about hate speech, and they can see how dangerous it is um, for them as a government as well. Like I think they, for example, when we met Azalina, the minister, she's very open to understand the available UN frameworks that I was keep talking about here, and she's open to it, to look into it. For example, I'm not sure how serious they are on that, but I think at least there are people in power, especially, she's the law reform minister. She would like to have a look into it, and we had a discussion on that. So I think it's more important for us to keep talking about it, keep pushing for it until they kind of um, hear it, and finally, like all the initiative and campaigns. For example, when we talk about Right to Information Act, it's a work of decades of work, people consistently talking about the same thing over and over and educate governments and everyone over and over. And now they are in the process of, to come up with this law. So I think it's a process, and I believe it will take even much longer. But I think, for us, like Article 19 or MCCHR or even CIJ, our other colleagues are doing our best to keep bringing these discussions over and over again in all our conversation with the governments, keep putting into their head that there's something else available, they should look into it. And I think, we just have to continuously do the work, I guess. I would say they might be open, they are open to listen, that is very sure. But how much efforts they're taking to make it, or to make it workable or practical, I'm not sure, but they are listening for sure. Yeah.
Thank you for the answer. Does anyone has a question? Please type in your question in chat box or unmute yourself. Okay. If no question, thank you for your overwhelming response. Unfortunately, we have to end our Q&A session due to a time constraint. Before leaving the meeting room, I would like to take a photo. Can you please turn on your camera? Okay, thank you for the participation, and please leave feedback form this webinar to better understand what went well and what can we be improved. And also put it in the chat box if you cannot see the feedback form after leaving the meeting room. On behalf of NCCHR, I would like to thank Ms. Nalini and all the participants for participating in today's webinar. And I hope that everyone gained valuable insight from our speaker. And we will end here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.